The amber flames of the great fire danced against the cave walls, casting long shadows that seemed to mock the faces gathered around its warmth. The autumn hunt had been successful. 3 massive elk lay butchered near the cave entrance, their rich meat promising full bellies through the coming cold days. The hunter-gatherer band of 40 souls celebrated with rare abandon, their voices echoing off the stone ceiling as they shared fermented berry wine and strips of roasted meat. Kael stood at the center of attention, his broad shoulders gleaming with sweat and firelight. At 28 winters, he was the strongest hunter the band had ever known, his spear arm capable of bringing down a charging mammoth. His dark hair hung in thick braids adorned with carved bone beads, trophies from his many kills. The younger hunters hung on his every word as he recounted the day's hunt, embellishing details with theatrical gestures. "The great bull turned on me," Kael boomed, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Its antlers wider than a man's outstretched arms, but I stood my ground, waiting for the perfect moment." He mimed throwing his spear, and the crowd cheered. Near the fire's edge, Nara sat quietly beside the other women, her thick hands methodically grinding seeds in a stone bowl. At 25 winters, she had never been chosen by any man, her heavy frame and plain features making her invisible to the hunters who sought slender, delicate mates. Her brown hair hung in a simple braid, unadorned by the shells and feathers the prettier women wore, yet her dark eyes held an intelligence that few bothered to notice, watching everything with careful attention. Old Brack, the eldest hunter at 52 winters, raised his drinking bowl with a gnarled hand. "Kael brings us meat, but when will he bring us sons? Even the strongest hunter needs a mate to continue his bloodline." Laughter rippled through the group, and several unmarried women straightened hopefully. Mila, the chief's daughter with her willowy frame and bright green eyes, smiled coyly at Kael from across the fire. Senna, known for her skill at weaving and her honeyed voice, tossed her golden hair over her shoulder. Kael grinned, enjoying the attention. "I could have my pick of any woman here," he declared, his chest swelling with pride. "The question is which one deserves the strongest hunter in the valley." "Choose Mila," called out young Jorik. "She's beautiful as summer flowers." "Senna would give you strong children," suggested another voice. The wine had made Kael bold and reckless. He surveyed the women with exaggerated consideration, basking in their hopeful gazes. "Any woman, you say?" He paused dramatically. "What if I told you I could make even the most challenging woman in our band a good wife?" The crowd murmured with curiosity. Kael's eyes swept around the circle until they landed on Nara, still grinding seeds with steady, methodical movements. A cruel smile played at his lips. "I wager," he announced loudly, "that I could take even Nara as my mate and make it work." He gestured toward her with his drinking bowl, spilling wine onto the cave floor. "The heaviest woman among us. I bet I could marry her and prove that the strongest hunter can succeed with any challenge." A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Several people gasped, while others shifted uncomfortably. Nara's hands stilled on her grinding stone, but she didn't look up. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing no emotion. "Kael," Mila whispered, her voice tight with dismay. "You cannot be serious." "Why not?" Kael laughed, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. "If I can bring down the fiercest beasts, surely I can handle one soft woman. Besides," he added with drunken confidence, "it would prove once and for all that I am capable of anything." Brack frowned deeply. "This is no game, young hunter. Marriage bonds are sacred, not fodder for wagering." But the damage was done. The other hunters were already placing their own bets, some wagering that Kael would back down, others that he would go through with it but regret it within a moon's cycle. The wine and excitement had transformed a celebration into a spectacle. Finally, Nara raised her head. Her dark eyes met Kael's across the dancing flames, and for a moment, the cave fell completely silent, except for the crackle of burning wood. "I accept," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the murmurs of surprise around her. Kael blinked, caught off guard by her calm response. He had expected tears, or protests, or perhaps for her to flee the cave in shame. Instead, Nara set down her grinding stone and rose to her feet with dignity. "If the strongest hunter wishes to wed the heaviest woman, then so be it," she continued, her gaze never wavering from his. "But know this, Kael, marriage is not a game to be won or lost. It is a bond that will test us both." The weight of her words seemed to sober some of the onlookers. Kael felt a flicker of uncertainty, but couldn't back down now, not with the entire band watching. His reputation was at stake. "So be it," he replied, raising his bowl in a mock toast. "We will be joined when the moon is full again 3 nights from now." As the crowd slowly returned to their celebration, the atmosphere had changed. The laughter was more forced, the conversations more subdued. Nara quietly returned to her work, grinding seeds as if nothing had happened, while Kael found that his victory felt strangely hollow. Near the back of the cave, old Thessa, the band's eldest woman and keeper of ancient knowledge, shook her grey head sadly. She had seen many winters and many fools, and she recognized the look in both Kael's and Nara's eyes. This wager would change more than either of them expected. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, but the consequences of Kael's boastful wager had only just begun. Dawn broke grey and cold over the valley, painting the autumn leaves in muted shades of amber and rust. Nara woke before the others, as was her custom, and slipped quietly from her sleeping furs near the cave's back wall. The dying embers of last night's fire cast barely enough light to see by, but she moved with practiced certainty through the familiar darkness. Her thick body ached more than usual this morning, not from any physical exertion, but from the weight of what had transpired. 3 nights. In 3 nights she would be bound to Kael, the man who had turned her into a public joke, yet as she rekindled the fire with steady hands, her face showed no trace of self-pity. The first orange flames licked at the dry kindling, and their light revealed Kael sprawled on his sleeping furs near the cave mouth, the place of honor reserved for the band's best hunters. Even in sleep, his body spoke of power. Broad shoulders, muscled arms marked with scars from countless battles with predators, legs strong enough to run down fleeing prey. Several unmarried women had positioned their sleeping areas nearby, hoping to catch his attention with their proximity. Nara had always slept at the back among the older women and the children, the forgotten ones who drew no second glances. "You're up early, child." The weathered voice belonged to Thessa, who emerged from the shadows like a spirit materialized from smoke. At 73 winters, she was ancient by the band's standards, her spine curved with age and her hair white as fresh snow. But her pale eyes missed nothing. "I couldn't sleep," Nara admitted quietly, feeding more wood to the growing flames. "The whole band is talking about it." Thessa lowered herself carefully beside the fire, her arthritic joints protesting the movement. "Let them talk. Words are like the wind, they blow fierce for a time, then pass. What matters is what remains when the storm ends." From across the cave came muffled laughter and whispered conversations. Small groups huddled together, stealing glances at both Nara and the still-sleeping Kael. The story of the wager had spread through the band like wildfire, growing more embellished with each retelling. "He was so drunk he could barely stand," Jorik was saying to his companion Davin. "When he sobers up completely, he'll realize what he's done and find a way out of it." "I don't know," Davin replied, glancing toward Nara. She accepted quickly enough. Maybe she's desperate to finally have a mate, even one who doesn't want her. The words stung, though Nara tried not to show it. Thessa caught her slight flinch and placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Fools judge a mammoth by its appearance and wonder why it tramples them," the old woman said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the gossiping hunters. They had the grace to look ashamed and moved their conversation elsewhere. As the morning progressed and more of the band awakened, the uncomfortable attention continued. Mila approached while Nara was preparing the morning meal, her beautiful face set in a mask of false concern. "Nara, dear," she said, her voice dripping with honeyed sympathy, "surely you don't intend to hold Kael to this foolishness. Everyone knows he was deep in his cups. A woman of your understanding would release him from such an unfortunate promise." Nara continued stirring the pot of grain porridge, her movement steady despite the anger building in her chest. "And what understanding is that, Mila?" The chief's daughter's green eyes flashed with barely concealed irritation. "You know what the other women whisper, that you should be grateful for any attention, even this humiliation, that a woman of your size and plainness has no right to expect—" "Expect what?" Nara's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. "Expect to be treated with basic dignity? Expect not to be the object of cruel jokes? Or perhaps you mean I should expect to step aside, so a prettier woman can claim what she believes is rightfully hers?" Mila's cheeks flushed red, her composure cracking. "How dare you suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Nara interrupted, finally looking up from her cooking. "I simply accepted what was offered. If that troubles you, perhaps you should speak with the one who made the offer." Before Mila could respond, a commotion near the cave entrance drew their attention. Kael had awakened and was surrounded by his hunting companions, all speaking at once in urgent, hushed tones. From the fragments Nara could hear, they were trying to convince him to withdraw his proposal. "Think of your reputation," Brack was saying, his lined face grave with concern. "You are the finest hunter this band has ever known. You could have your choice of any woman in the valley, beautiful women who would bear you strong sons and bring honor to your name." Kael ran his hands through his dark hair, clearly struggling with the enormity of what he had done. In the harsh light of day, with his head clear of wine, the wager seemed less like bold confidence and more like catastrophic stupidity. "The whole band was there," he muttered. "I can't simply pretend it didn't happen." "You were drunk," Jorik insisted. "Everyone understands that wine makes men say foolish things. No one would blame you for reconsidering." Kael's eyes found Nara across the cave, taking in her heavy frame as she worked over the cooking fire. Even from a distance he could see the steady competence in her movements, the way she ignored the stares and whispers surrounding her. Something about her calm dignity made him feel smaller than he had in years. "She accepted," he said finally, "in front of everyone. If I withdraw now, if you go through with it, you'll regret it for the rest of your life," Brack warned. "Marriage isn't a hunt, boy. You can't simply walk away when the challenge proves too great." But even as the hunters continued their arguments, Kael found himself watching Nara with growing curiosity. There was something in her bearing, something he had never noticed before. She moved with quiet purpose, unbroken by the cruel attention focused on her. When had he ever seen her complain or weep over her lot? When had he ever seen her beg for acceptance or approval? The realization unsettled him. In all his years of being celebrated and praised, had he ever shown half her quiet strength? As if sensing his gaze, Nara looked up and met his eyes across the cave. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The celebrated hunter and the dismissed woman, bound now by words spoken in wine and witnessed by fire. Neither looked away first. The second day after the wager dawned with an ominous sky, heavy grey clouds that promised the season's first serious storm. The air itself seemed thick with tension, matching the mood that had settled over the hunter-gatherer band. Everyone moved through their daily tasks with unusual quiet, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the approaching marriage more real. Kael had barely slept, tossing on his furs as doubt gnawed at him like a persistent predator. He rose early and gathered his hunting gear, desperate to escape the cave and the weight of too many watching eyes. But as he prepared to leave, his path took him past where Nara sat sorting through dried herbs and roots near the fire. She worked with methodical precision, her thick fingers surprisingly gentle as she separated plants into different pouches. Each herb was examined carefully before being placed in its designated container, and she occasionally lifted them to her nose, testing their potency with the skill of someone who had spent years learning their properties. Despite himself, Kael found his steps slowing. He had never paid attention to what the women did when the men were hunting, dismissing their work as simple and unimportant. But watching Nara now, he realized there was more complexity to her task than he had imagined. "What are you doing?" The question left his lips before he could stop it. Nara glanced up, surprised. In all the years they had shared the cave, Kael had never addressed her directly, except to ask her to pass food or move from his path. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for mockery or cruel intent, but found only genuine curiosity. "Preparing medicines," she replied carefully. "Winter sickness will come soon, and the band will need remedies for fever and cough." Kael squatted down beside her, studying the array of plants spread across the hide. "How do you know which ones to use?" "Thessa taught me." Nara held up a bundle of dried leaves. "This is willow bark. It breaks fever and eases pain, but too much can cause the stomach to bleed, so it must be measured carefully." She set it aside and picked up another plant. "This is elderberry, good for cough and congestion, but the leaves and bark are poisonous if prepared wrong." As she spoke, her voice gained confidence. This was knowledge she had spent years acquiring, skills that could mean the difference between life and death for her people. Kael found himself leaning closer, intrigued despite himself. "What about that one?" He pointed to a cluster of small, dark roots. "Bloodroot." Nara's tone grew serious. "Very powerful, very dangerous. It can stop bleeding that would otherwise kill, but a hair's breadth too much will stop the heart instead. I've seen it save Brack's life when a boar's tusk opened his leg, and I've seen it kill when another healer grew careless with the dose." The weight of her knowledge struck Kael suddenly. Here was a woman who held the power of life and death in her careful hands, who understood secrets that could preserve or destroy. Yet she was dismissed as worthless because her body was larger than what men preferred to look upon. "Who else knows these things?" he asked. "Thessa, but she grows old and her memory sometimes fails. Her granddaughter Vera knows some, but she's still learning." Nara's expression grew troubled. "When Thessa passes to the next world, much knowledge could die with her if it's not properly preserved." Before Kael could respond, commotion erupted near the cave entrance. Young Tam, barely 16 winters old, stumbled inside, supported by 2 other hunters. Blood streamed from a deep gash across his forehead, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Bear!" gasped Jorik, one of Tam's companions. "A mother with cubs. We surprised her near the berry thickets. Tam tried to climb a tree, but she pulled him down." The band erupted into concerned voices and rushed movement. Several people called for Thessa, but the old healer was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to spread as Tam's blood continued to flow, dripping steadily onto the cave floor. Without hesitation, Nara rose and moved toward the injured hunter. "Bring him to the fire," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I need light to see the wounds properly." "Where's Thessa?" demanded Tam's father, Corvin, his face pale with fear. "Gathering water plants by the river," someone replied. "She won't be back for hours." "We can't wait," Nara said firmly, already examining Tam's injuries with gentle but sure hands. "The head wound needs immediate attention, and this arm is broken badly. Mila, bring me clean water. Senna, I need my medicine pouch, the large one with the bone clasp." For a moment, the women hesitated. They were accustomed to following Thessa's lead in healing matters, not taking orders from Nara. But Tam groaned in pain and blood continued to flow from his scalp. "Do it," Kael said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that made other hunters follow him into battle. "She knows what she's doing." The women scattered to fetch what Nara had requested. She worked with calm efficiency, cleaning the head wound and examining its depth. "It looks worse than it is," she announced, relief evident in her voice. "The bone isn't cracked, just the skin torn, but it will need stitching." As she prepared her needle and sinew, Nara began giving instructions. "Corvin, hold your son's shoulders still. Davin, support his broken arm, gently. The bone is displaced and needs to be set before it can heal properly." "Can you do that?" Corvin asked, his voice tight with worry. Nara met his eyes steadily. "I've done it before, but it will hurt him greatly, and he may lose consciousness from the pain." "Better conscious and hurting than dead," Corvin replied grimly. What followed was a demonstration of skill that left the entire band watching in silent amazement. Nara stitched the head wound with precise, even stitches that would heal cleanly. Then, with Tam braced by strong hands, she carefully manipulated the broken bone back into position. The young hunter screamed once before fainting, but when consciousness returned, his arm was properly splinted and the bleeding had stopped. "He'll live," Nara announced quietly, washing the blood from her hands. "The arm will be weak for a full season, but it should heal straight if he follows my instructions." Corvin knelt beside his son, then looked up at Nara with tears in his eyes. "You saved his life. How can I ever repay such a debt?" "No debt," Nara replied simply. "We are all one band. His welfare is everyone's responsibility." As the crowd slowly dispersed and Tam was settled comfortably near the fire, Kael remained behind. He watched Nara clean and organize her healing supplies, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. "You could have let him die," he said finally. "After the way this band has treated you, you could have claimed ignorance and waited for Thessa." Nara paused in her work, considering his words. "And what would that have gained me? Revenge on a boy who never harmed me? The satisfaction of watching his father grieve?" She shook her head. "Cruelty breeds cruelty, Kael. I choose to break that cycle." In that moment, looking at her calm face in the firelight, Kael realized he had never truly seen Nara before. He had looked at her countless times, but he had seen only what he expected to see, a plain, heavy woman of no particular worth. Now, for the first time, he saw strength, wisdom, and a quiet compassion that humbled him. Tomorrow night, this remarkable woman would become his wife, and he was beginning to understand that he might be the one who was unprepared for what that truly meant. The third day arrived with the storm that had been threatening since dawn. Rain hammered against the cave mouth, while wind howled through the valley like the voices of angry spirits. Lightning split the grey sky, and thunder rolled across the mountains with such force that the cave walls themselves seemed to tremble. It was, the elders muttered, an inauspicious day for a wedding. Despite the weather, or perhaps because of it, the atmosphere inside the cave crackled with tension. The binding ceremony would take place at sunset, as tradition demanded, but the anticipation had everyone on edge. Some whispered that the storm was a sign the spirits disapproved of this union. Others argued it was merely autumn asserting its dominance over the valley. Nara spent the morning in unusual solitude. The other women, normally quick to include her in their daily tasks, seemed uncertain how to treat someone who would soon be the mate of their finest hunter. She used the quiet time to prepare herself, bathing in warmed water and braiding her dark hair with the few ornaments she possessed, a carved bone comb that had belonged to her mother, and a simple necklace of polished river stones. She had no special clothing for the ceremony. Unlike Mila or Senna, who possessed finely made garments decorated with dyed leather and traded beads, Nara owned only practical items designed for work rather than beauty. Her wedding dress would be her everyday tunic of tanned hide, clean but unremarkable. Thessa found her sitting alone near the back of the cave, staring at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror, another inheritance from her mother and one of her few treasures. "Second thoughts, child?" the old woman asked gently, settling beside her with a soft grunt of effort. "Many thoughts," Nara admitted, "but not about withdrawing. I gave my word." "And Kael, has he spoken with you since yesterday?" Nara shook her head. After witnessing her healing of young Tam, Kael had grown strangely quiet and distant. She had caught him watching her several times, his expression unreadable, but he had made no effort to approach her. Whether this was from shame, regret, or simple uncertainty, she couldn't tell. "He's afraid," Thessa said, as if reading her thoughts. For the first time in his life, Kael faces something he cannot defeat with strength or skill. It terrifies him. "Marriage isn't a battle to be won," Nara replied softly. "No, but he doesn't understand that yet. Give him time. Some lessons can only be learned through living them." As afternoon faded toward evening, the preparations began in earnest. The great fire was built higher than usual, its flames dancing wildly in the drafts that swept through the cave. The band's few musical instruments, drums made from stretched hide, flutes carved from bone, and rattles filled with dried seeds, were brought forth and tested by their players. Jorik and Davin had decorated the ceremonial area with what greenery they could find despite the storm. Branches of evergreen pine, late-blooming wildflowers that had survived the recent frosts, and strips of bright-colored cloth that had been acquired through trade with distant bands. The food preparation fell largely to the women, who worked with nervous energy to create a feast worthy of the occasion. Even those who had whispered cruel words about Nara found themselves caught up in the ritual importance of the moment. A wedding was a celebration for the entire band, regardless of personal feelings about the couple involved. As the sun began its descent behind the storm clouds, Brack stepped forward in his role as the band's senior hunter and informal leader. Though they had no formal chiefs or rulers, his age and experience gave him the authority to conduct ceremonies and settle disputes. "Let the bride and groom come forward," he announced, his weathered voice carrying clearly over the sound of rain and crackling flames. Nara rose from her place and walked to the fire's edge, her movement steady despite the eyes focused upon her. She had twisted her hair into an intricate braid that revealed the strong line of her neck and jaw, and the firelight softened her plain features, lending them a dignity that some of the watchers were seeing for the first time. Kael emerged from the group of hunters, dressed in his finest tunic, one decorated with bone beads and strips of fur from his most challenging kills. He was undeniably magnificent, his broad shoulders and confident bearing marking him as a man born to lead and fight. Yet as he took his place beside Nara, something in his posture suggested he was facing his greatest challenge. "Marriage," Brack began, his voice taking on the formal cadence used for important ceremonies, "is the joining of two lives into one purpose. It is the promise to hunt together, to share the lean times and the abundant ones, to protect each other from all dangers, and to work for the good of the band and any children the spirits may bless you with." He paused, looking directly at each of them in turn. "Do you, Kael, promise to take Nara as your mate, to provide for her and defend her, to honor her wisdom and share your strength?" Kael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice was clear when he answered, "I do." "Do you, Nara, promise to take Kael as your mate, to support him and counsel him, to tend his wounds and share his burdens?" "I do," Nara replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. Brack nodded and picked up a length of leather cord decorated with small carved animals, symbols of fertility and protection. "Then let your hands be bound as your lives are bound." As tradition demanded, Kael and Nara extended their right hands toward each other. Brack wrapped the cord around their joined wrists, speaking the ancient words that had sealed countless unions before theirs. What the fire witnesses, let no storm break apart. What the band celebrates, let no enemy destroy. What the spirits bless, let time itself honor. The cord was tied with a complex knot that would need to be worn for 7 days before being removed and kept as a sacred reminder of their vows. Thunder crashed overhead as if the very sky were applauding or protesting the completion of the ceremony. "Let the feast begin," Brack declared, and the band erupted into celebration. What followed was a night of forced merriment that felt both genuine and artificial. The musicians played with enthusiasm, and the dancers moved with energy around the fire. Food and drink flowed freely, and toasts were raised to the new couple's health and fertility. Yet beneath the festivities, an undercurrent of uncertainty persisted. This was not the wedding anyone had expected to attend. Glances were exchanged, whispers shared behind cupped hands, and more than one person wondered what the morning would bring. As the night deepened and the celebration gradually wound down, the moment everyone had been anticipating and dreading finally arrived. It was time for the bride and groom to retire to the private alcove that had been prepared for them at the far end of the cave. The traditional calls and jokes that usually accompanied this moment seemed muted tonight, as if the band sensed that this couple needed privacy more than public encouragement. One by one, the others settled into their sleeping furs, leaving Kael and Nara to face their first night as husband and wife. In the alcove, lit by a small fire of its own, away from the curious eyes of the band, they sat on opposite sides of the flames, the hunter and the healer bound now by law and custom, yet still strangers to each other in all the ways that mattered most. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the cave, an entirely different kind of tempest was about to begin. The private alcove felt smaller than it had appeared from a distance. The flickering flames of their personal fire cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, creating an intimate space that seemed worlds away from the main cave where the rest of the band now slept. The leather cord still bound their wrists together, a tangible reminder of the vows they had just spoken. Kael sat rigidly on his side of the fire, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. The man who could face down charging predators without flinching found himself uncertain how to begin a conversation with his new wife. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the crackling of burning wood and the distant rumble of thunder. Nara, meanwhile, busied herself arranging their sleeping furs and organizing the few personal belongings that had been moved to their new shared space. Her movements were calm and methodical, but Kael noticed the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her own nervousness. "I never asked," Kael said finally, his voice rough with disuse, "about your parents. I know they died when you were young, but—" Nara paused in her arranging, surprised by the unexpected question. "Fever took them both when I was 12 winters old. My mother went first, then my father 3 days later. Thessa took me in afterward. That must have been difficult." It was. Nara settled cross-legged on her furs, studying her new husband's face in the firelight. "But Thessa was kind. She taught me everything I know about healing, about reading the signs in plants and weather. My mother had some knowledge, but Thessa—" She gestured vaguely. "Thessa carries the wisdom of generations." Kael nodded, then found himself saying, "My father died hunting when I was 15. Mammoth trampled him when a spear throw went wrong. My mother grieved herself to death within the year." It was more personal information than he had shared with anyone in years. Something about the firelight and the strange intimacy of their situation was loosening his usually guarded tongue. "I remember," Nara said softly. "You changed after that, became more driven, like you had something to prove." "I did." Kael's jaw tightened. "Everyone was watching to see if I would be worthy of my father's reputation, whether I could become the hunter the band needed. And you succeeded. You became the finest hunter anyone has ever seen. Yet here I am," Kael said with bitter irony, "bound to a woman I chose as a jest, unsure of everything for the first time in my adult life." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and honest. Nara absorbed them without flinching, though they cut deep. "Is that what I am to you?" she asked quietly. "A jest that went too far?" Kael looked at her, really looked, and felt shame wash over him. "I thought so. 3 days ago I thought you were nothing more than an easy target for my arrogance." He ran his free hand through his hair. "But yesterday, watching you save Tam's life, seeing the knowledge you carry, the strength you show," he trailed off, struggling for words. "What changed your mind?" "You did. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. "You didn't have to help him. After the way I humiliated you, after the way this band has always treated you, you could have let him suffer. Instead, you risked everything to save his life. That takes a courage I'm not sure I possess." Nara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "You think courage means facing down predators and leading hunts, but that's not the only kind of bravery that matters." "What do you mean?" "Every day I wake up knowing that most of this band sees me as worthless. Every day I endure the whispers, the dismissive looks, the assumption that I contribute nothing of value. Yet I continue to serve, to heal, to care for people who would rather I didn't exist." She met his eyes steadily. "That requires its own kind of strength." Kael felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of truth he had never considered. "Why do you do it? Why not leave, find another band where you might be valued?" "Because this is my home. These are my people, even if they don't always act like it. And because—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction. "Because I believe people can change. I believe that kindness can triumph over cruelty, given time and patience. Even after what I did to you, especially after what you did to me." Nara's voice was firm. "You made a cruel wager while drunk on wine and praise, but you also kept your word when you could have found excuses to withdraw. And now you're here, asking questions instead of assumptions, trying to understand instead of simply endure." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks dancing upward toward the smoke hole. In the renewed light, Kael saw something in Nara's face that humbled him, a generosity of spirit that he had never encountered before. "I don't deserve your patience," he said quietly. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. We're bound now for better or worse. We can make this marriage a battle where we both lose, or we can try to build something worthwhile together. And if I don't know how to do that, if I've spent so long being the strongest, the best, the most admired, that I've forgotten how to be simply human?" Nara leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes serious. "Then you learn. The same way you learn to hunt, to track, to read the signs of weather and season, step by step, mistake by mistake, until it becomes as natural as breathing. Will you teach me?" The question surprised them both. Kael, who had never asked anyone to teach him anything since childhood, found himself genuinely wanting to understand this woman who had shown such unexpected depths. Nara, who had been dismissed and ignored for so long, felt something warm kindle in her chest at his earnest request. "If you truly want to learn," she said carefully, "but you have to understand, I won't be a prize you won or a burden you bear. I'll be your equal partner with my own thoughts and needs and contributions. I'm beginning to realize," Kael said slowly, "that you might be the stronger of us two. Strength isn't about being stronger than someone else. It's about being strong enough to build something together that neither could create alone." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. The thunder moved farther away, and the rain settled into a gentler rhythm against the cave mouth. But inside their alcove, something new was beginning, tentative and fragile, but real. As they prepared for sleep, still bound by the ceremonial cord, both Kael and Nara felt the weight of possibility settling around them. This marriage had begun as a joke, but it might yet become something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. The first night of their union ended not with passion or conflict, but with understanding, the rarest and most valuable foundation upon which any partnership could be built. The morning after their wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Nara woke first, her body accustomed to rising before the rest of the band. The ceremonial cord still connected her wrist to Kael's. They would wear it for 6 more days as tradition demanded, but sometime during the night, they had unconsciously moved closer together for warmth. Kael's face in sleep looked younger, less burdened by the weight of constant expectation. Nara studied his features in the early light filtering through the cave mouth, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been invisible to him. Now they shared sleeping furs and the promise of a lifetime together. She began to carefully extract herself from the furs without waking him, but his eyes opened immediately, the instant alertness of a hunter always ready for danger. "Good morning," she said softly, settling back rather than risk jerking the cord that bound them. Kael blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar intimacy of waking beside someone. "Morning." He sat up slowly, running his free hand through his disheveled hair. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough. And you?" "Better than I expected." It was true. Despite his nervousness about their first night together, he had slept more peacefully than he had in weeks. "What happens now?" Now we begin learning to live as husband and wife. Nara began braiding her hair with one hand, the other still tethered to his. The cord makes everything more complicated for the next few days, but it serves a purpose. It forces couples to work together, to consider each other's needs and movements. As if to demonstrate her point, Kael stood up and immediately felt the slight tug on his wrist as the cord went taut. He looked down at Nara, who was still seated, and realized he would need to wait for her or help her up rather than simply walking away as he normally would. "I never thought about how restrictive this tradition might be," he admitted, offering her his hand. "Most couples know each other well before marriage. They've had time to learn each other's habits and rhythms." Nara accepted his help to stand. "We're doing everything backward." They made their way to the main cave together, their joined hands making movement awkward, but not impossible. The rest of the band was beginning to stir, and Nara could feel the weight of curious stares as they appeared together. "How did the great hunter sleep?" Jorik called out with a grin that held only slight malice. "Was the marriage bed all you expected?" Several other hunters chuckled, but Kael's response surprised them. Instead of joining in with boastful comments or crude jokes, he said simply, "I slept well. Thank you for asking." The unexpected dignity of his response seemed to deflate the teasing mood. Jorik looked puzzled, clearly having expected either complaints or exaggerated claims of conquest. As they approached the central fire, Thessa looked up from the porridge she was stirring and smiled warmly. "Good morning, you two. How are you finding married life so far?" "Enlightening," Kael replied, which earned him a surprised glance from Nara. "Challenging," she added with a small smile, "but not impossibly so." The day proceeded with the normal tasks of band life, but everything was complicated by the need for Kael and Nara to coordinate their movements. When the hunters gathered to plan the day's expedition, Kael found himself explaining why he couldn't join them. "The cord prevents it," he said, trying to keep embarrassment from his voice. "I can't range far from the cave while bound to my wife." "Surely she could come along," suggested Davin. "Women sometimes accompany hunting parties." "Not for the kind of hunt you're planning." Nara spoke up before Kael could respond. "Tracking deer through the deep forest requires stealth and speed. A bound couple would only slow you down and alert the prey." Brack nodded approvingly. "Wise words. The girl knows hunting even if she doesn't participate." It was a small recognition, but Nara felt a flutter of warmth at being acknowledged for her knowledge rather than dismissed. "What will you do instead?" asked Corvin, who still looked at Nara with deep gratitude for saving his son's life. "There's work to be done around the cave," Kael said, though he looked uncertain about what that might involve. His life had been consumed by hunting for so long that he barely understood the daily tasks that kept the band fed and functioning. "Come," Nara said gently, tugging him toward where the women were working. "I'll show you." What followed was a revelation for Kael. He watched Nara identify which foods needed preservation for winter, how to properly clean and stretch hides for maximum softness and durability, and the intricate process of creating tools from bone and stone. Her knowledge seemed limitless. She knew which plants could be woven into waterproof baskets, how to judge the quality of clay for pottery, and dozens of other skills he had never bothered to learn. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked as she demonstrated the proper technique for scraping a deer hide. "From watching, listening, trying." Nara's hands moved efficiently across the hide. "When you're not valued for beauty or strength, you find other ways to make yourself useful. But this is incredibly valuable knowledge. Why doesn't everyone learn these things?" "They do to some extent, but most people specialize. Hunters focus on hunting, mothers on child-rearing, elders on wisdom-keeping. I've had the time and freedom to learn broadly because," she gestured to herself with a wry smile, "because no one expected me to do anything else." Kael was beginning to understand that what he had seen as Nara's worthlessness was actually her greatest strength. She possessed knowledge that crossed all the traditional boundaries of gender and age, making her irreplaceable in ways he had never imagined. "Teach me," he said suddenly. Nara looked up from her work. "Teach you what?" "All of it. Everything you know. I've spent my whole life learning to kill things and bring them home. I want to learn what happens next, how to preserve the meat, use the bones, tan the hides properly." He met her eyes earnestly. "I want to understand what you do." For a moment, Nara could only stare at him. No man had ever asked to learn women's work. The very suggestion would have been laughable to most of the band. "Are you certain? The others will mock you for taking interest in such things." "Let them mock." Kael's voice held new conviction. "I'm tired of being ignorant about half of what keeps our people alive." So Nara began to teach, and Kael began to learn. His hands, so skilled with weapons, proved clumsy at first, with the delicate work of hide preparation and food preservation. But he was a quick student, and his questions showed a genuine desire to understand, rather than simply endure the instruction. As the day progressed, other members of the band began to take notice. Some whispered about the mighty hunter lowering himself to women's work. Others watched with curious interest as Kael struggled to master tasks they had taken for granted. But it was Thessa who understood the significance of what she was witnessing. "That boy is growing up," she murmured to herself, watching Kael carefully follow Nara's instructions on how to judge when meat was properly dried. "And that girl is finally being seen for who she truly is." By evening, when the hunting party returned with fresh game, Kael had gained a new appreciation for the complex web of skills that sustained their band. More importantly, he had begun to see his wife not as the butt of a cruel joke, but as a repository of vital knowledge, a teacher whose worth far exceeded his own limited understanding. The second night of their marriage found them both exhausted, but oddly content. As they settled into their sleeping furs, still bound by the ceremonial cord, Kael turned to face Nara in the firelight. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For being patient with my ignorance. For showing me how much I didn't know about my own people's survival." Nara smiled, the first truly warm smile she had ever directed at him. "Thank you for wanting to learn. Most people prefer their assumptions to uncomfortable truths." As they drifted towards sleep, both of them began to suspect that this strange marriage might become something neither had dared to hope for, a true partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. On the fourth day of their binding, winter arrived with brutal suddenness. The band woke to find snow falling heavily outside the cave, transforming the familiar valley into an alien landscape of white silence. The temperature had plummeted during the night, and frost covered everything within reach of the cave mouth. "Early winter," Brack muttered, studying the storm with worried eyes. "Too early. The final hunt preparations aren't complete, and we're short on preserved meat." The early arrival of winter was more than an inconvenience. It was a potential disaster. The band had counted on several more weeks of hunting weather to build up their stores for the long, harsh months ahead. Now they faced the possibility of starvation before spring returned. As the hunters gathered to discuss emergency hunting expeditions, a commotion arose near the cave entrance. Mila stumbled inside, her face pale and her breathing labored. She had been gathering late berries when the storm struck and had barely made it back to safety. I can't catch my breath," she gasped, collapsing near the fire. Her lips had a blue tinge that immediately alarmed the watchers. "Thessa!" someone called, but the old healer was already hurrying over, her aged joints protesting the quick movement. Thessa examined Mila with gentle hands, listening to her chest and studying her color in the firelight. Her expression grew grave as she worked. "Lung fever," she announced finally. "The cold and wet have settled in her chest. Without treatment, it will spread through the band like wildfire." A murmur of fear rippled through the gathering. Lung fever in winter could decimate an entire band, especially when confined together in close quarters. They had all heard stories of groups found dead in their caves, victims of disease that spread faster than treatment could follow. "What can be done?" asked Mila's father, the band's informal leader. Thessa looked troubled. "The usual remedies: willow bark, elderberry, steam treatments with pine needles. But my supplies are low, and the storm makes gathering fresh plants impossible." "There are other ways," Nara said quietly from where she knelt beside Kael. All eyes turned to her as she continued. "My mother taught me about lung fever before she died. There's a treatment using heated stones and herb-soaked cloths that can break the congestion before it spreads." "I've never heard of such a method," Thessa said, though her tone held interest rather than dismissal. "It comes from the eastern bands, near the Great Lakes. My mother learned it during a trade journey when she was young." Nara looked directly at Thessa. "But it requires precise timing and specific preparations. If done wrong, it can harm rather than heal." Thessa studied her former student's face carefully. "Show me." What followed was a demonstration of knowledge that impressed even the skeptical hunters. Nara directed the preparation of a complex treatment involving heated river stones wrapped in wet moss, aromatic steam created from pine needles and dried herbs, and a series of positioning techniques designed to help the patient breathe more easily. But the most impressive part was Nara's diagnostic skill. As she worked, she explained to Thessa exactly what signs to watch for: The subtle changes in breathing pattern that indicated whether the treatment was working, the skin color variations that showed if infection was spreading, and the precise timing needed for each phase of the cure. "Where did you really learn this?" Thessa asked quietly as they worked together over Mila's prone form. "From my mother, as I said, but also from necessity." Nara's hands never paused in their careful ministrations. "When you're not valued for other things, you learn to make yourself indispensable through knowledge. I've spent years studying every healing technique I could find, learning from traders and travelers who passed through our territory." Kael watched his wife work with growing amazement. The woman he had dismissed as worthless was proving herself more valuable than any hunter or gatherer in the band. Her knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for all of them. As the day progressed, Mila's condition began to improve. Her breathing became easier, the blue tinge faded from her lips, and her fever broke in carefully controlled stages. By evening, she was sitting up and taking broth, weak but clearly recovering. "You saved my life," Mila said to Nara, her voice hoarse but sincere. After the way I spoke to you before your wedding, you had every right to let me suffer." Nara shook her head gently. "Healing isn't about who deserves what. It's about preserving the life and strength of our people." But Mila's recovery created a new problem. Word of Nara's advanced healing knowledge spread quickly through the band, and soon people were approaching her with every minor ailment and old injury. The demand for her attention threatened to overwhelm her, especially while she remained bound to Kael. "This is impossible," Kael muttered, as they tried to examine an elder's arthritic joints while tethered together. "You need freedom to move, to gather supplies, to work properly." "The cord comes off tomorrow," Nara reminded him. "Then things will be easier." "No, they won't." Kael's voice held a new understanding. "Tomorrow, when the cord is removed, everyone will expect me to return to hunting, while you handle all the healing duties alone. But you can't do everything. You need help, support, someone who understands what you're trying to accomplish." Nara paused in her examination of the elder's swollen knuckles. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the strongest hunter isn't always the most valuable member of a band. Maybe the person who can keep everyone alive and healthy matters more than the one who brings home the biggest kills." That evening, as they settled into their sleeping furs for the second-to-last night of their binding, Kael made a decision that would change both their lives. "I want to continue learning from you," he said quietly. "Not just the basic skills you've been teaching me, but the healing knowledge. I want to become your partner in this work, not just your husband." Nara turned to face him in the firelight, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "You would give up hunting? Give up your position as the band's greatest warrior?" "Not give up entirely, but share the responsibility. Divide my time between hunting and healing." "You're right, I've been ignorant about what really keeps people alive." He met her gaze steadily. "I want to learn everything you can teach me." Outside the cave, snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in winter's harsh grip. But inside their alcove, something warm and powerful was growing between them, a partnership that would prove stronger than either had imagined possible. Tomorrow, the ceremonial cord would be cut, officially ending the binding period of their marriage. But Kael and Nara were beginning to understand that their true bond was just beginning to form, built not on obligation or tradition, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. The test of winter had revealed something neither had expected. They were stronger together than either could ever be alone. The seventh day dawned cold but clear, the early winter storm having passed through the valley like a harsh promise of harder days to come. Inside the cave, the band gathered around the central fire for the cord-cutting ceremony that would officially end Kael and Nara's binding period. Thessa approached them with the sacred knife used for such rituals, a blade of obsidian so sharp it could slice through leather without effort. The old healer's eyes held a knowing gleam as she studied the couple before her. 7 days you have been bound, she intoned in the formal language of ceremony. 7 days to learn if your spirits can walk the same path. What have you discovered in this time? Kael and Nara looked at each other, their hands still connected by the leather cord that had forced them to move as one for a full week. So much had changed since that first awkward night by their private fire. "I have learned," Kael said carefully, "that strength takes many forms. The woman I married possesses knowledge and wisdom that make her invaluable to our people's survival." "I have learned," Nara added, her voice steady and clear, "that even the proudest heart can choose to grow and that partnership built on respect creates something stronger than either person alone." Thessa nodded approvingly. and raise the obsidian blade. Then let the cord be cut, but let the bond it represents remain unbroken. The sharp stones sliced through the leather as easily as cutting grass. For the first time in 7 days, Kael and Nara were physically free to move independently, yet neither immediately stepped away from the other. "How do you feel?" Nara asked quietly, as she rubbed her wrist where the cord had rested. "Strange," Kael admitted. "Lighter, but also incomplete, somehow." The band began to disperse, returning to their daily tasks with the ceremony concluded. But before the hunters could claim Kael's attention, he made an announcement that stunned everyone present. "I will not be joining the hunting party today," he declared, his voice carrying the authority that had always commanded respect. "Instead, I will be working with my wife to establish better healing preparations for winter." Brack's weathered face creased with confusion. "But Kael, we need every able hunter now that winter has come early. The band's survival depends on gathering as much fresh meat as possible before the deep cold sets in. The band's survival depends on staying healthy enough to last until spring," Kael replied firmly. "What good is meat if half our people die from lung fever? What value are successful hunts if we lose our elders and children to preventable illness?" Jorik stepped forward, his expression troubled. "You're the finest hunter we have. Your spear arm has fed this band for years. Surely the women can handle healing duties while the men do what they do best." "The women have been handling healing duties," Kael said, his tone growing sharp. "One woman, specifically, my wife, who possesses knowledge that could save all our lives. But she's been working alone, overwhelmed, unable to properly train others or gather the supplies she needs." He looked around the circle of faces. "I choose to help her, because her work is just as vital as hunting." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some of the hunters looked scandalized at the idea of their greatest warrior concerning himself with women's work. Others, particularly those who had family members saved by Nara's skill, nodded thoughtfully. "It's unnatural," muttered Davin. "Men hunt, women tend the hearth. That's how it's always been." "And how has that worked for us?" Nara asked quietly, speaking up for the first time. "How many people have we lost over the years to injuries that could have been treated better? How many times have we suffered through illnesses that might have been prevented with proper knowledge?" Mila, still weak from her recent bout with lung fever, struggled to her feet. "Nara saved my life with knowledge none of the rest of us possessed. If Kael can learn those same skills, multiply that knowledge." She looked around at the gathered band members. "Wouldn't we all be safer?" Old Corvin nodded vigorously. "She saved my son Tam when Thessa wasn't available. Having more than one skilled healer could mean the difference between life and death for any of us." The debate continued for some time, with voices raised on both sides. But ultimately the decision rested with Kael himself. He was a free man, bound only by his own choices and the needs of his family. "I have made my decision," he said finally. "I will continue to hunt when the band truly needs me, but I will also learn healing. We cannot afford to lose Nara's knowledge when she grows old, and we cannot expect her to carry such responsibility alone." Thessa, who had remained silent throughout the argument, finally spoke. "The boy shows wisdom. Knowledge dies with its keeper unless it is shared and preserved. If Kael can learn even half of what Nara knows, the band will be stronger for it." With the matter settled, Kael and Nara set about reorganizing their approach to the healing work. Free from the restricting cord, they could move independently to gather supplies, but they chose to work together whenever possible. Their first task was to create a proper inventory of medicinal supplies and identify what was needed before winter deepened. Nara led Kael through the storage areas, explaining how different herbs were preserved, which ones lost potency over time, and what quantities were needed to treat various ailments. "We're short on willow bark," she noted, examining their stores, "and our elderberry supply won't last past midwinter if lung fever spreads through the band." "Where can we find more?" Kael asked, already thinking like a hunter tracking necessary resources. "Willow grows near the river, but it's dangerous to harvest in winter conditions. Elderberry," she frowned thoughtfully. "There might be some dried berries still clinging to bushes in the sheltered valleys, but it would require a long expedition to gather enough." "Then we'll make the expedition," Kael said simply. "Tomorrow if the weather holds." Nara stared at him. "We, Kael, you've never gathered plants before. It's skilled work and dangerous in winter conditions." "Then teach me," he replied, echoing the words that had become their refrain. "You know what to look for. I know how to track and navigate in harsh conditions. Together we can gather what the band needs." As they worked through the day, planning their expedition and preparing equipment, word spread through the cave about their partnership. The reactions varied dramatically. Some continued to view Kael's choice as a betrayal of masculine duty, while others began to see the practical wisdom in cross-training skills that had traditionally been segregated by gender. But it was young Tam, still recovering from his encounter with the bear, who provided the most insightful comment. "Maybe," he said to his father that evening, "the strongest hunter isn't the one who can kill the biggest prey. Maybe it's the one smart enough to learn whatever skills his people need most." That night, as Kael and Nara prepared for sleep in their alcove, no longer bound by cord but choosing to remain close, they reflected on the day's events. "Are you certain about this path?" Nara asked. "You're giving up a great deal to learn healing. The other hunters may never fully accept your choice." Kael considered this seriously. "I've spent my entire adult life being what others expected me to be, the greatest hunter, the strongest warrior, the man other men wanted to become. But these past 7 days, working with you, learning from you," he paused, searching for the right words. "For the first time, I feel like I'm becoming who I was meant to be." "And who is that?" "Your partner," he said simply. "In all things, not just your husband, but your true companion in the work that matters most." Outside their alcove, winter winds howled through the valley, promising months of hardship ahead. But inside the warm circle of their shared purpose, Kael and Nara felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited them, together, unbound by tradition, but united by choice. The expedition to gather winter medicines began before dawn, with Kael and Nara moving silently through the snow-covered valley. The early winter storm had left a pristine white blanket over everything, beautiful but treacherous. Each step had to be carefully placed to avoid hidden rocks or sudden drops concealed by the deceptively smooth surface. Kael carried his hunting pack loaded with tools for plant gathering, sharp knives for cutting bark, leather pouches for berries and roots, and rope for reaching high branches. But more importantly, he carried a new kind of knowledge, hard-won through days of intensive learning from his wife. "There," Nara whispered, pointing toward a cluster of trees near the partially frozen river. "Willow. See how the bark has that distinctive pattern, even in winter." Kael studied the trees carefully, committing their appearance to memory. His hunter's eye, trained to spot the smallest details, proved surprisingly useful for identifying plants. "The bark looks different on the younger branches. Is that significant?" "Very observant." Nara's voice held genuine pride. "Younger bark has more of the healing compounds we need. It's also easier to harvest without killing the tree." They worked together in comfortable silence, Nara teaching and Kael learning with the focus he had once reserved for tracking dangerous prey. The willow bark came away in long fibrous strips that would be dried and ground into powder for treating fever and pain. It was while they were working on the 4th tree that they heard the voices. Both froze instantly, their hunter-gatherer instincts screaming danger. Strange voices in winter meant only one thing, another band moving through their territory. In the harsh season, such encounters were rarely friendly. Desperation drove people to acts they would never consider in times of plenty. Kael motioned for silence and crept toward the sound, with Nara following close behind. Through the bare winter branches, they could see movement, at least 8 figures making their way along the riverbank. Even at a distance, their condition was clearly desperate. Their clothing was ragged, their movement spoke of exhaustion and hunger, and they traveled with the urgent pace of people fleeing something terrible. "Raiders," Kael breathed, recognizing the signs. A surviving remnant, maybe from a band that was attacked or driven from their territory. Nara studied the distant figures with growing concern. "Look how they move. They're not just hungry. Some of them are injured. And that woman in the rear, she's carrying a child." The ethical dilemma hit them both simultaneously. These strangers represented potential danger to their own band, especially if desperation drove them to violence, but they were also fellow humans, possibly including children, suffering in the killing cold of winter. "We should return to the cave immediately," Kael said, his hunter's training asserting itself. "Warn the others. Prepare defenses." "Wait." Nara's healer instincts warred with her survival sense. "Look at them again." "Really look." Kael forced himself to observe more carefully, using the analytical skills his wife had been teaching him. What he saw changed his assessment entirely. The strangers weren't scouting or moving with the purpose of raiders. They were stumbling, struggling clearly at the end of their endurance. "They're dying," he realized with shock. "Those aren't raiders. They're refugees." The moral weight of the situation settled on them both. Leaving desperate people to die in the winter cold went against everything Nara believed about preserving life. But bringing strangers to their cave during the harsh season could endanger their entire band if resources ran short. "What do we do?" Nara asked quietly. Before Kael could answer, one of the distant figures collapsed in the snow. The others gathered around, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air, voices filled with grief and desperation. "They won't survive another night in the open," Nara said with quiet certainty. "Whatever drove them from their home, whatever dangers they might represent, they're human beings facing death." Kael found himself at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but the kind of man he was choosing to become. The old Kael, focused solely on strength and dominance, would have seen only the potential threat. But the man who had spent the past week learning about compassion and healing saw something different. "Stay here," he said finally. "Keep hidden, but be ready to run back to the cave if things go wrong." "Where are you going?" "To talk to them. If they're truly refugees, maybe we can help. If they're raiders pretending to be helpless—" He touched the knife at his belt. "I'll be ready." Nara caught his arm as he started to move. "Be careful. And remember, fear makes people dangerous, even good people." Kael approached the strangers openly, his hands visible but his posture alert. As he drew closer, his assessment proved correct. These were not raiders, but the survivors of some terrible disaster. Their faces were gaunt with hunger, their clothing inadequate for the cold, and several bore obvious injuries. "Who approaches?" called out a man who seemed to be their leader, raising a makeshift spear with trembling hands. "A hunter from the Valley Band," Kael replied, stopping at a respectful distance. "We saw your collapse. Do you need aid?" The strangers exchanged glances, hope and suspicion warring in their expressions. Their leader, a man about Kael's age with frost-bitten fingers and haunted eyes, lowered his weapon slightly. "We are what remains of the mountain band," he said with exhausted dignity. "The others, they were killed 3 days ago. Raiders from the northern wastes attacked our cave. We are all that escaped. How many of you are there?" 8. 2 elders, 3 hunters, 2 women, and a child." The man's voice broke slightly. "The child is sick with fever, and old Merrin collapsed just now. We don't think she'll rise again." Kael looked at the huddled group, seeing their desperation and knowing that his next decision would ripple through many lives. The hunter in him calculated resources, measured risks, weighed survival odds. But the healer his wife was teaching him to become saw only suffering that could be relieved. "Our cave is less than an hour's walk," he said finally. "We have food, warmth, and a skilled healer, but I must speak honestly. Winter has come early, and our own supplies are limited. Taking in 8 more mouths will strain everyone." The leader of the refugees nodded gravely. "We understand. We ask only for enough aid to reach the Eastern Territories, where my sister's band might take us in. A few days' rest, some food to give us strength for the journey." "The Eastern Territories are weeks away through winter mountains," Kael pointed out. "That journey would kill you all." Before the stranger could respond, Nara appeared beside Kael, having abandoned her hiding place when she saw the collapsed elder. Without hesitation, she knelt beside the old woman in the snow, checking for signs of life. "She's alive, but barely," Nara announced. "Severe exhaustion, exposure, and—" She lifted the woman's eyelid gently. "Early stages of snow blindness. She needs immediate warmth and care, or she'll die within hours." The decision was made in that moment, though not by any formal discussion. Nara was already organizing the rescue, directing the refugees to support their weakest members, while Kael gathered their scattered belongings. "Can your band spare aid for fellow humans in desperate need?" the refugee leader asked formally, the ritual words that placed obligation on any hunter-gatherer band with resources to share. Kael looked at his wife, saw the determination in her face, and knew there was only one answer he could give and still respect the man he was becoming. "Our cave is your cave until the storm passes," he replied, speaking the traditional response. "Our fire is your fire. Our food is your food." As they began the difficult journey back through the snow, supporting the weakest refugees between them, Kael wondered what reaction they would face when they arrived at the cave with 8 unexpected mouths to feed. The band was already struggling with early winter and limited supplies, but looking at Nara as she carefully tended the sick elder while walking, he knew they had made the only choice their conscience would allow. The test of winter was proving to be about more than just survival. It was about what kind of people they chose to be when faced with others' desperate need. The arrival of 8 refugees at the cave entrance created immediate chaos. The band members who first spotted the approaching group reacted with alarm, reaching for weapons and calling warnings to the others. Only Kael's authoritative voice prevented panic from erupting into violence. "Stand down," he commanded as hunters emerged with spears raised. "These are refugees under our protection, not raiders." But even as weapons were lowered, the tension remained thick as winter air. The band gathered around the cave mouth, staring at the newcomers with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. 8 more people meant 8 more mouths to feed during what was already promising to be a harsh winter. Brake stepped forward, his lined face grave with concern. "Kael, what have you done? Our stores are already stretched thin with early winter. We cannot feed so many additional people." "We gave the ritual promise," Nara said quietly, supporting the nearly unconscious elder refugee as they entered the cave. When asked for aid by desperate travelers, we answered with the ancient words. To break that promise now would bring shame on our entire band. The refugees huddled near the entrance, clearly aware of the unwelcome atmosphere. Their leader, who had introduced himself as Gareth during the journey, maintained his dignity despite their desperate circumstances. "We do not seek charity," he said formally. "We ask only for temporary shelter while we recover strength for the journey to the Eastern Territories. We have skills to offer in exchange for your kindness." "What skills?" demanded Jorik, his voice sharp with skepticism. "You have no tools, no weapons, no supplies. What could you possibly offer that would justify the food you'll consume?" Before Gareth could answer, one of the refugee women stepped forward. Despite her exhausted state, she carried herself with quiet authority. "I am Vera, medicine woman of the mountain band. I carry knowledge of healing herbs that grow only in the high places, treatments your valley healers may never have seen." Thessa's eyes sharpened with interest. "What manner of treatments?" "Remedies for the bone ache that comes with age, preparations that can ease the pain of childbirth, ways to treat the lung rot that kills so many in winter caves." Vera's voice grew stronger as she spoke of her expertise. "I also know the signs that warn of avalanche and icebreak in mountain country, and I am a toolmaker," added one of the refugee men, a stocky individual with scarred hands. "I can work metal as well as stone, create blades that hold their edge longer than any you've seen." Despite these offers, the mood in the cave remained tense. Several band members whispered among themselves, their concerns evident even without hearing their words. Finally, it was Mila who gave voice to what many were thinking. "They speak of skills and knowledge, but that doesn't solve the immediate problem. We have barely enough food stored for our own people. Adding 8 more could mean starvation for all of us before spring." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. Even those sympathetic to the refugees' plight couldn't ignore the mathematics of survival. The band's carefully calculated food stores had been planned for their existing numbers, not for a 50% increase in mouths to feed. "Then we adapt," Kael said firmly. "We increase hunting efforts, extend foraging into new areas, find ways to make our resources stretch further." "In winter," Breck's voice held disbelief. "Boy, you speak as if the season hasn't changed. Game is scarce now, plants are dormant, and every expedition risks death from cold and storm. People adapt or they die," Nara said quietly, but her words carried clearly through the cave. "That's been true since the first humans faced their first winter. We can choose to help each other survive, or we can choose to let fear make us cruel." The debate continued for over an hour, with voices raised on both sides. Some argued for the moral obligation to help fellow humans in desperate need. Others insisted that compassion was a luxury they couldn't afford when their own survival hung in the balance. Finally, it was old Corvin who proposed a compromise. 7 days, he said, his voice cutting through the argument. "We give them 7 days to rest and recover. If they choose to continue their journey, then we provide what supplies we can spare. If they prove their worth during that time," he shrugged, "perhaps longer-term arrangements can be made." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered a middle path that both factions could accept. The refugees would receive immediate aid, but with clear limits that protected the band's long-term survival. Gareth nodded gravely. 7 days is generous. We accept your terms with gratitude. As the band dispersed to accommodate their unexpected guests, Nara immediately set about treating the most urgent medical needs. The collapsed elder, Merrin, was suffering from severe exposure and exhaustion. The feverish child, a boy of perhaps 6 winters, needed immediate attention to prevent his illness from spreading to others. Kael found himself in the strange position of coordinating resources for people he had never met. trying to stretch limited supplies to cover expanded needs. It was a different kind of problem-solving than hunting, requiring careful calculation and creative thinking rather than strength and skill. "We'll need to cut food rations by a quarter for everyone," he told Nara, as they worked together to treat the refugees. "It's not ideal, but it's manageable for a week." "And if some of them choose to stay permanently?" Nara asked while preparing medicine for the sick child. "Then we face harder choices. The band can support perhaps 2 or 3 additional people long-term, but not 8. Kael's expression was troubled. "We may have to ask some to leave, even if it means almost certain death." The ethical weight of such decisions pressed down on both of them. They had acted from compassion in bringing the refugees to safety, but compassion alone couldn't solve the brutal mathematics of winter survival. Over the following days, the refugees proved their worth in small but meaningful ways. Vera shared her knowledge with Thessa and Nara, teaching them about mountain plants that could supplement their limited medicine stores. The metal worker, Dan, began crafting improved tools using techniques unknown to the Valley Band. But it was young Tam who made the most significant discovery. While helping Gareth repair torn clothing, he learned that the refugee leader possessed extensive knowledge about the Northern Territories, including the movements and habits of the raiders who had destroyed his band. "They'll come south when the deep winter sets in," Gareth warned during an evening gathering around the fire. "The northern wastes can't support them once the snow deepens. They'll raid every cave and camp between here and the Great River, taking what they need to survive." The implications struck the band like a physical blow. They had been so focused on the immediate challenges of feeding extra mouths that they hadn't considered the larger threat approaching from the north. "How many raiders?" Brack asked grimly. "At least 20, perhaps more. They've absorbed survivors from other bands they've conquered, growing stronger with each victory." Gareth's face was haunted by memories. "They strike without warning, take everything of value, and leave no one alive who might seek revenge." Suddenly, the 8 refugees looked less like a burden and more like a valuable source of intelligence about a deadly threat. The knowledge they carried about the raiders' tactics and timeline could mean the difference between survival and destruction for the entire Valley Band. As Kael lay in his sleeping furs that night, listening to the wind howl outside the cave, he realized that their act of compassion had become far more complicated than simply sharing food. They had taken in not just refugees, but witnesses to the storm of violence heading their way. The test of winter was proving to involve far more than cold and hunger. Soon, they would face the ultimate challenge, defending their home and their people against enemies who showed no mercy to the weak. The warning came on the 6th day, delivered by a lone hunter who stumbled into their valley more dead than alive. His name was Soren, and he belonged to the river band that lived 2 valleys to the north. What he brought was news that chilled everyone more thoroughly than the winter wind. "They came in the night," he gasped between gulps of warm broth, his frost-bitten hands shaking as he held the bowl. "No warning, no mercy. The raiders swept through our cave like a winter storm, killing anyone who resisted and taking everything we had stored for winter." The cave fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and Soren's labored breathing. Every member of the band understood what this meant. The northern raiders were moving south faster than anyone had anticipated. "How many survived?" Gareth asked quietly, his face grim with recognition of the pattern he had seen before. "4 of us escaped into the forest." "I don't know if the others made it." Soren's voice cracked with grief and exhaustion. "I've been running for 3 days trying to warn the southern bands. They'll reach this valley within days, maybe less." Brack stood slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement. "How many raiders?" "At least 30 now. They've taken fighters from the bands they've conquered, forced them to join or die." Soren looked directly at Gareth. "They're looking for you specifically. Their leader, a man called Iron Fist, wants revenge for your escape. He's sworn to kill every member of your band, even the ones who fled." The refugees exchanged glances full of fear and guilt. Their presence hadn't just brought extra mouths to feed. It had marked the Valley Band as a target for the most vicious raiders anyone had ever encountered. "We should leave immediately," Gareth said, starting to rise from his position by the fire. "Our presence here endangers all of you." "If we go now." "And travel where?" Kael interrupted sharply. "Into winter mountains with sick children and elderly. You'd be dead before you reached the next valley, and the raiders would still come here looking for you. Better that we die than bring death to those who showed us kindness," Vera said firmly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "No." The word came from Nara, spoken with quiet authority that surprised everyone. "We don't abandon people to die, and we don't let fear make us act like cowards. If the raiders are coming, we prepare to defend ourselves. all of us, together. Fight 30 raiders with our numbers? Jorik's voice held disbelief. We have maybe 15 people capable of combat, and half of those are past their prime. Then we don't fight them directly, Kael said, his mind already working through possibilities. We use the advantages we have, knowledge of the terrain, preparation time, and the fact that they don't know we've been warned. What followed was the most intense planning session the band had ever undertaken. Gareth and the other refugees shared everything they knew about the raiders' tactics, weapons, and weaknesses. Dan the metalworker began crafting additional spear points and arrowheads, using every scrap of metal available. The women and children were organized into teams responsible for securing supplies and creating escape routes if the defenses failed. But it was Nara who proposed the most crucial element of their strategy. We can't defeat 30 raiders in open combat, she said during a hushed planning meeting. But we don't have to. We just have to make attacking us more costly than they're willing to pay. What do you mean? Brack asked. Look at their pattern. They attack bands that seem weak and vulnerable, overwhelming them quickly to minimize their own losses. But if we make ourselves look like a harder target, if we inflict enough casualties in the initial assault, she gestured toward Gareth, they might decide we're not worth the cost and move on to easier prey. That's assuming they're rational, Gareth warned. Iron Fist has a personal grudge now. He might attack regardless of cost, just for revenge. Then we prepare for that possibility too. Kael's voice held the cold determination that had made him the band's greatest hunter. Multiple defensive positions, fallback plans, ways to make them pay for every step they take into our territory. The next 2 days passed in frantic preparation. The cave entrance was fortified with sharpened stakes and carefully positioned stones that could be dropped on attackers. Hidden caches of food and weapons were established in the forest, providing resources for survivors if the main defense failed. Most importantly, Nara worked with unprecedented urgency to prepare medical supplies for the wounded. She and Vera combined their knowledge to create treatments for the kinds of injuries combat would inevitably produce, while training several band members in basic field medicine. I've never prepared for anything like this, Nara confessed to Kael on the night before the expected attack. They sat in their alcove, sharpening weapons and checking equipment by firelight. Healing is about preserving life, not preparing for people to lose it. You're doing both, Kael replied, testing the balance of a newly crafted spear. The preparations you're making will save lives when the fighting starts. That's still healing, just preventive healing. Despite the dire circumstances, Nara smiled at his characterization. Is that what we're calling it? We're calling it whatever we need to call it, to get through tomorrow. Kael set down his weapon and took her hands in his. Are you afraid? Terrified, she admitted, but not just of dying. I'm afraid of what this violence will do to us, to our people. Whether we'll still be the same band afterward, or if surviving will require us to become something harder and crueler. That's why we fight, Kael said firmly. Not just to survive, but to preserve the ability to show compassion, to help refugees, to choose kindness over cruelty. If we lose that, then the raiders win, even if we drive them off. As dawn approached, bringing with it the likelihood of violence and death, the band made their final preparations. Fighters took their positions, non-combatants moved to secured areas, and everyone understood their role in the desperate plan they had crafted. The refugees, despite their exhaustion and limited weapons, insisted on taking positions alongside their rescuers. They had brought this danger to the Valley Band, and they would not hide while others fought to defend them. Whatever happens today, Gareth said to Kael as they watched the sun rise over the valley rim, know that your kindness gave my people hope when we had none. That matters, regardless of how this ends. It's not over yet, Kael replied, gripping his spear as he scanned the tree line for signs of movement, and as long as we're breathing, we keep fighting for the right to show kindness in a cruel world. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. But somewhere in the forest, 30 raiders were moving toward them with murder in their hearts. The final test was about to begin. The attack came at midday, when the sun hung directly overhead and cast the shortest shadows. The raiders moved through the forest like a pack of hunting wolves, silent and coordinated, believing they were approaching an unsuspecting prey. They were wrong. The first sign of their approach came from young Tam, positioned high in a tree with instructions to watch for movement. His bird call, 3 sharp notes that mimicked a winter jay, echoed across the valley, alerting every defender to prepare for battle. Kael crouched behind the fortified cave entrance, his heart pounding with anticipation rather than fear. Beside him, Nara held a bow with hands that were steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. Throughout their defensive positions, the combined members of both bands waited with the patience of experienced hunters. The raiders emerged from the tree line in a loose formation, 30 figures clad in mismatched armor and furs, taken from their victims. At their head walked a massive man, whose iron-studded club gave him his fearsome name, Iron Fist, the killer of bands, the destroyer of homes. "Valley dwellers!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We know you harbor the mountain cowards who escaped our justice. Send them out along with half your winter stores, and we might let the rest of you live." Brack stepped forward as the band's spokesman, his aged voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "We harbor refugees who asked for aid according to ancient custom. We will not surrender guests who have sought our protection." Iron Fist's laughter was harsh and cold. "Then you choose death. We are 30 strong, hardened fighters who have conquered every band we've encountered. What are you? Farmers and berry pickers playing at being warriors?" "We are people defending our home," Kael called out, rising from his concealment. "And you'll find we're prepared to pay any price to protect what matters to us." The raider leader's eyes narrowed as he studied the fortifications that had been erected around the cave entrance. He had expected to find a typical band's simple defenses, not the careful preparation that met his gaze. "Attack formations!" Iron Fist commanded, raising his massive club. "Take the cave and kill anyone who resists." What followed was not the easy slaughter the raiders had anticipated. The defenders had used their preparation time well, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the approach to the cave into a killing ground. Arrows flew from hidden positions, spears thrust from concealed pits, and rolling stones crashed down from carefully positioned heights. The raiders' first assault broke against the defenses like waves against stone cliffs. Several of their number fell wounded or dead, while the defenders remained largely protected behind their fortifications. But Iron Fist was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Roaring commands, he reorganized his forces for a more coordinated attack, using the terrain and superior numbers to pressure multiple defensive positions simultaneously. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. The defenders' preparation and defensive positions kept casualties low, but their limited numbers meant every loss weakened them significantly. The raiders, meanwhile, found themselves paying a far higher price than expected for each advance. It was during the third major assault that the tide began to turn. Iron Fist himself led a charge against the main cave entrance, his massive club smashing through wooden barriers as if they were twigs. Several defenders fell back before his advance, creating a gap in their line. Kael found himself face to face with the raider leader, spear against club in single combat, while chaos raged around them. Iron Fist was larger and stronger, his weapon capable of crushing bone with a single blow. But Kael had spent years perfecting his skills, and he fought now not just for victory, but for the protection of everything he had learned to value. The duel was brutal and swift. Iron Fist's club whistled through the air with crushing force, only to meet empty space as Kael moved with the fluid grace of an experienced hunter. The spear point found gaps in the raider's armor, drawing blood and wearing down his massive opponent through precise, targeted strikes. But it was Nara who provided the decisive moment. Seeing her husband pressed by the larger man's relentless attacks, she moved from her position with a hunter's knife in her hand, not to strike Iron Fist directly, that would have been suicide, but to hamstring one of his advancing warriors who threatened Kael's flank. The brief distraction was all Kael needed. His spear found its mark, piercing Iron Fist's chest and dropping the massive raider leader to the stone floor of the cave. The sight of their leader's fall broke the raiders' coordinated assault. Some fled immediately, disappearing into the forest as quickly as they had emerged. Others tried to continue fighting, but without Iron Fist's commanding presence, their attacks became disorganized and desperate. When the last raider had either fallen or fled, an exhausted silence settled over the valley. The defenders emerged from their positions, tending to their wounded and surveying the cost of their victory. 7 members of the combined bands had been killed, including old Maren, the refugee elder, who had insisted on fighting despite her age and infirmity. Twice that number bore wounds that would take weeks to heal, but they had survived, and more importantly, they had proven that cooperation and careful preparation could triumph over brute force and cruelty. In the days that followed, as the band buried their dead and treated their wounded, a new understanding emerged about what they had accomplished together. The refugees were no longer temporary guests, but full members of the community. their knowledge and skills integrated into the band's survival strategy. Vera and Nara established a formal partnership in healing duties, combining their different traditions into a more comprehensive approach to medicine. Dan the metalworker became indispensable for creating and maintaining superior tools and weapons. Most importantly, Gareth's knowledge of the Northern Territories proved invaluable for establishing trade relationships with distant bands. But the most significant change was in Kael and Nara themselves. The marriage that had begun as a cruel jest had become a true partnership, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They had learned to see strength in forms they had never recognized, to value knowledge alongside physical prowess, and to understand that the greatest victories came not from defeating others, but from protecting what mattered most. As winter deepened and snow covered the valley in pristine white, the expanded band settled into routines that reflected their new understanding. Hunting remained important, but so did healing, crafting, teaching, and all the other skills that sustained human life. One evening, as Kael and Nara sat by their private fire, she asked him a question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "Do you ever regret it? The wager that brought us together?" Kael considered this seriously, as he had learned to consider all her questions. "I regret the cruelty of it, the public humiliation I subjected you to. I regret how long it took me to see your true worth." He paused, adding wood to their fire. "But regret the outcome? Never. You've made me a better man than I ever thought possible, and you've shown me that people can change, that even the proudest heart can learn humility and compassion." Nara leaned against his shoulder, watching the flames dance. "I think we've both become stronger by learning to be strong together." Outside their alcove, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the cave. Refugees and original band members playing together with no distinction between them. It was the sound of hope, of a community that had chosen cooperation over competition, inclusion over exclusion. The test of winter had revealed many truths about survival, but perhaps the most important was this. The greatest strength lay not in individual prowess, but in the bonds that connected people to each other. In choosing to help strangers, to defend the helpless, and to build bridges across differences, they had discovered something more valuable than any victory in combat. They had learned what it truly meant to be human. As spring approached and the worst of winter's grip began to loosen, Kael and Nara looked forward to a future built on the foundation they had created together. Their marriage, which had begun with such unlikely circumstances, had become the cornerstone of a stronger, more compassionate community. And in the growing warmth of each new day, they saw the promise that kindness, properly nurtured and fiercely defended, could indeed triumph over the cruelest challenges the world might offer. The hunter and the healer had found their greatest strength not in what they could accomplish alone, but in what they could build together, a legacy of courage, compassion, and unshakable unity that would endure long after their own stories had passed into legend.